Moving cargo between countries by train is a relatively simple affair. If a train was travelling through a country as a through route, then the trains can be sealed with a customs or immigration seal. As the train is simply passing through a country, the country would not legally recognise the cargo as long as nothing was loaded or unloaded from the wagons. This saved companies unneeded taxes as they passed through. In 1917 though, one sealed train made history. Despite his heartlessness and lack of mercy, there was no doubt that Vladimir Lenin had exceptional intellectual abilities, a near enough photographic memory, and one of the keenest minds of the 20th century. His radical views got him expelled from university, and by 1889 he was one of the loudest voices for the works of Karl Marx and the Marxism movement. Lenin would continue to champion Marxism for the next 10 years and rose up to be one of its leading champions, all the while evading any police spies. He travelled to Switzerland and Berlin, where he managed to obtain several publications banned by Russia and smuggled them home. These publications and his own work would be distributed to workers on strike, hoping to fan the flames of a revolution. But while publishing these works, the law caught up with him and he ended up arrested. In his time in prison awaiting his fate, Lenin started to write more and more. But a year after he was arrested and was exiled for 3 years and kept under surveillance. Still, he kept in contact with other revolutionaries and some were actually visiting him. In 1903, he was in London, where the Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was held. The Congress finalised the creation of the Marxist Party, but although Lenin was a supporter, there was divisions within the party itself. He led a faction of the party called the Bolsheviks. By the end, the Bolsheviks held the majority and were growing in strength. On the 22nd of January 1905, a group of unarmed demonstrators led by Father Gregory Grapon marched on St. Petersburg to formally give a petition to then Tsar Nicholas II, calling for reforms on state power and improvements to working conditions. The demonstrators were fired upon and 40 of them were killed. Father Gabon escaped the shooting and Lenin encouraged the Bolsheviks to rise up against the regime. After the revolution, the Tsar promised to agree to some of the demands, but he backtracked in 1907. Lenin left Russia, partly in disgust, and knowing he would not be able to bolster the people without fear of reprisal, and imposed himself in self-exile abroad. But in 1905, an incident sparked what would be the Russian Revolution, setting the stage for the Second Revolution, which would abolish the monarchy in 1917. Lenin was in the Ukraine when the First World War was announced, and as Russia was his native homeland, Lenin was once again arrested. He spoke out against the Tsar and was freed. When the revolution caused the Tsar to abdicate, Lenin celebrated with his dissidents and decided now was the perfect time to return to Russia to seal his place at the head of the Bolshevik movement and place himself in power. By now he was at his base at Switzerland and Germany lay between him and his homeland. But Lenin knew he had to get home. In the meantime, Germany was keen to get the war over and done. Their money was dwindling and their population was starving. When Swiss socialist Robert Grimm offered the German government a way out, they hoped that sending Lenin into Russia would destabilise the country enough for them to pull out of the war first. Russia was in the same situation as Germany, and it too wanted out of the war. The Germans hoped that if Russia could pull out, then the coalition of the First World War, including Britain, would be in jeopardy. And of course it would cause chaos internally. Seeing an opportunity, they agreed to the deal, but on one condition. Lenin knew the risks too. If he was seen doing deals with Germany, then he was literally on the block for treason. On the 9th of April 1917, Lenin, his wife, and 30 other members of his entourage boarded a train. He read a small farewell speech on the platform before he boarded. His supporters on the platform pleaded for him not to go and were horrified that a deal with the Germans had been struck and feared for his safety. In Germany, the train stopped by the Swiss border and the party was transferred to a single carriage. The carriage had 8 compartments with a space for luggage and toilet facilities. The delegates would be afforded no luxuries. The carriage wasn't strictly sealed like cargo, but the delegates had no passport checks or border control and would never be officially recognised as going through Germany, and it was hoped they would just slide by. The train would have to negotiate around the 4 state railway systems, so it was decided that the carriage, rather than giving it special treatment, would be uncoupled and then recoupled to the ends of the various timetabled trains, with engine changes at the railway site's border. It was carefully calculated not to impact any other traffic, including military. Although Germany was allowing the party to travel, they wouldn't do it alone. A group of soldiers boarded with them. The soldiers were in their own sealed part of the train, and 3 of the compartments on the Russian end were closed off with chalk markings, citing them sealed. Neither the soldiers or the Bolsheviks met and were not even allowed to speak to each other, but the Germans did give the train highest priority. The train would pass through the countryside and small towns, and occasionally the train had to stop, but the party was not allowed to move or get off. But by the time they got to Frankfurt, word had spread about the train and soldiers awaited them early on the platform. The train arrived late and there was a real worry that the party would miss the ferry, so the next morning the train was given a top priority. But despite this, it was clear that the train was behind schedule, so the party was taken to Berlin to the Stettin station. After leaving there, it headed to the dockside for the ferry out. During the 8-day journey, Lenin made notes, but on the way he kept getting interrupted by his colleagues arguing about smoking. Smoking was allowed in the designated areas, but with the carriage sealed, it made it impossible for the smokers to get to these areas easily. So Lenin helped devise a ticketing system for the smokers to use one of the compartments. Lenin himself loathed the habit, but knew better than to argue with someone who was feeling cramped up with cabin fever and nicotine withdrawal. To stop Lenin's journey being prematurely stopped at the Russian border and to bypass the majority of the fighting, it was decided that for the party to travel by a ferry to Sweden. Sweden was a neutral party in the war. They welcomed Lenin and the passengers and were able to stretch their legs, and the mayor treated them to a full breakfast. Considering they had only eaten basic rations, they took full advantage, with plates practically licked clean. The mayor also treated Lenin to shop at a department store to prepare for his return. After passing through Finland on the 16th of April, the train pulled up in St. Petersburg. He arrived to glorious fanfare. The next morning, he published the April thesis. As the Tsar was not in power anymore, a temporary government was running the country. Lenin denounced both them and the war. As the people were growing more and more against the war, they sided with Lenin. In less than 7 months, the provisional government was overthrown and Lenin was declared leader. Germany's plan was ultimately set to fail. Russia did pull out of the war, as expected, and Germany's plan kinda worked, as the Russians were forced to concede the war, which made Germany stronger. But Britain, France and the Allies were winning battle after battle, and with the United States joining in 1917, Germany realised that it was no longer possible to win the war. They surrendered in 1918, the guns fell silent, and they were blamed solely for starting it. They signed the Treaty of Versailles, which sanctioned the country heavily. As for Lenin, he went on to put his theses into practice, which were greatly received. His policies led to the creation of the communist regime, which was well in place, put into the 90s. But Lenin was only to see a small proportion of this as he passed in 1924. His body is still currently lying in state and can be viewed today. After the fall of the regime in 1991, he is loathed, hated, idolised and loved. But those 8 days going underground in a sealed train under the ordinary German noses, it's got to be downright brazen.